The moment Lydia Hartfield saved the child's life was the moment she sealed her own fate. Though she would not understand this for weeks to come. England, 1809. The morning sun cast pale golden light through the tall windows of Westmore Hall, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Miss Lydia Hartfield stood before the window of the nursery schoolroom, watching as carriages arrived in the circular drive below, depositing guests for yet another social gathering she would not attend. At 8 and 20, Lydia had become intimately familiar with the peculiar state of being neither servant nor lady. As governess to Lady Cecilia Cavendish, she occupied that strange middle ground of the household hierarchy, too educated and well-born to dine in the servants' hall, yet too impoverished and employed to sit at the family table. The daughter of the late Viscount Hartfield, she had once moved through drawing rooms and ballrooms with the confidence of her station. That life had ended 6 years ago with her father's death and the revelation of debts that had consumed their entire estate. "Miss Lydia, you are wool-gathering again," came a small voice behind her. Lydia turned to find Lady Cecilia Cavendish regarding her with those impossibly blue eyes that were so like her uncle's. The child sat at her desk, slate and chalk abandoned, golden curls escaping from their ribbons as they always did by mid-morning. "My apologies, dearest," Lydia said, moving away from the window to examine Cecilia's work. "Let us see how you are progressing with your sums." The little girl was 7 years old, an orphan since the age of 5 when her parents had perished in a carriage accident. She had been raised since then by her uncle, Alexander Cavendish, the Duke of Westmore, though raised was perhaps too generous a word. The Duke was a distant figure in the child's life, appearing for formal dinners and occasional inquiries about her education, but otherwise occupied with the management of his vast estates and his seat in Parliament. Lydia had been employed at Westmore Hall for 2 years, engaged shortly after the death of the Duke's wife in childbirth. The Duchess had perished along with her infant son, leaving the Duke a widower at 31. In the 2 years since, he had worn his grief-like armour, cold and impenetrable. Their paths crossed occasionally in the corridors of the great house. The Duke would nod with distant courtesy, murmur some pleasantry about the weather or Cecilia's health, and continue on his way. Lydia doubted he could have described the colour of her eyes or hair if asked. To him, she was simply Miss Hartfield, the governess, as interchangeable and unremarkable as the wallpaper. "I have completed all my sums," Cecilia announced with evident pride. "May we walk in the gardens now? The roses are blooming, and I should like to pick some for my room." Lydia examined the slate and smiled. The child was bright, quick with numbers and letters both. "Very well done indeed. Yes, we shall walk before luncheon. Fetch your bonnet and pelisse." As Cecilia scampered off to the adjoining bedchamber, Lydia moved to the small mirror on the wall and adjusted her own simple day-dress of grey muslin. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a severe style appropriate to her station, and her green eyes looked tired. She had not slept well of late. The Dowager Duchess, the Duke's mother, had taken to making pointed comments about economies in the household, and Lydia feared her position might be in jeopardy. The Dowager Duchess Margaret Cavendish was a formidable woman of 58, silver-haired and ramrod straight, with cold brown eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everyone they encountered. She had never approved of Lydia's employment, viewing a viscountess's daughter as either too grand for the role or too fallen to be trusted. Lydia had never been certain which. The dowager's manner toward her was one of studied contempt, a constant reminder that Lydia had been reduced from the ranks of ladies to something far less. "I am ready," Cecilia called, reappearing in her pale blue pelisse and straw bonnet. They descended the grand staircase together, Cecilia's small hand in Lydia's larger one. The entrance hall was bustling with activity as footmen carried trunks and hat boxes. More guests arriving for the house party the Dowager had organised, no doubt. Lydia caught sight of elegant travelling cases monogrammed with a coat of arms she did not recognise. "Miss Hartfield," came a cool voice from above. Lydia looked up to see the Dowager Duchess standing on the landing, magnificent in a morning dress of deep burgundy, her silver hair perfectly arranged. Beside her stood a young woman of perhaps 24, strikingly beautiful with dark hair and fine features, dressed in the height of fashion. "Your Grace," Lydia said, curtsying as Cecilia did the same. "I trust you are keeping Lady Cecilia to her lessons," the Dowager said, her tone suggesting doubt. "We have guests arriving, as you can see. I expect the child to remain in the nursery wing during the entertainments. We cannot have her underfoot." "Of course, Your Grace," Lydia replied quietly. The beautiful young woman beside the Dowager was examining Lydia with unconcealed curiosity. "Is this the governess?" she asked in a voice that managed to make the title sound like something distasteful. "Lady Vanessa Blackwell, may I present Miss Hartfield?" the Dowager said, with perfunctory courtesy. Miss Hartfield was the daughter of Viscount Hartfield before his unfortunate financial difficulties. She now serves as governess to my granddaughter. The casual cruelty of the introduction, the emphasis on unfortunate financial difficulties, made Lydia's cheeks burn, but she kept her expression neutral. This was not the first time the Dowager had taken pleasure in reminding her of her fall in circumstances. "How industrious," Lady Vanessa said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "One must admire those who find employment when misfortune strikes." "Indeed," the Dowager agreed. "Now, Miss Hartfield, you may continue your walk. Lady Vanessa and I have much to discuss regarding this evening's dinner arrangements." Dismissed, Lydia led Cecilia toward the rear entrance that opened onto the gardens. Behind them, she could hear Lady Vanessa's voice carrying clearly in the marble hall. "She is quite pretty for a governess. Is that wise, with your son unmarried?" The Dowager's reply was too low to distinguish, but her tone was dismissive. Lydia felt her stomach tighten. So Lady Vanessa was a prospective bride for the Duke. She should not have been surprised. The Dowager had been vocal about her son's need to remarry and produce an heir. The gardens of Westmore Hall were extensive and beautiful, laid out in the formal style with carefully trimmed hedges and gravel paths. Cecilia ran ahead to examine a bed of roses, calling back observations about their colours and scents. Lydia followed more slowly, grateful for the solitude and fresh air. She had been alone for so long now. 2 years in this house, invisible to most, pitied by some, resented by others. She took her meals in her small sitting room adjacent to the nursery, neither fish nor fowl, belonging nowhere. On the rare occasions when the Duke and Dowager entertained on a grand scale, Lydia would sometimes stand at the window of her chamber and watch the guests arrive in their fine carriages, the ladies in their jewels and silks, the gentlemen in their evening clothes. It was like watching a play from the cheapest seats, distant and removed from the actual performance. "Miss Lydia, come see," Cecilia called, and Lydia pushed aside her melancholy to join the child among the roses. They spent a pleasant hour in the gardens before returning inside for luncheon. Cecilia took her meal in the nursery as always, and Lydia joined her, sitting at the small table, while a maid brought up trays of cold chicken and bread with butter. Through the open window, she could hear music drifting from the drawing room below, where the Dowager was entertaining her guests. That evening, after Cecilia had been put to bed with a story and a kiss on the forehead, Lydia retired to her own small chamber. It was simply furnished but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a wardrobe, a writing desk, and a single upholstered chair by the fireplace. She sat in the chair with a book, but found herself unable to concentrate on the words. A knock at her door startled her. "Come in," she called. Mrs. Fowler, the head housekeeper, entered with a sympathetic expression. She was a woman of 52, grey-haired and competent, and had always been kind to Lydia. "Begging your pardon, Miss Hartfield, but I thought you should know. The Dowager has invited you to take tea in the drawing-room tomorrow afternoon." Lydia's heart sank. The Dowager never invited her to anything. Did her Grace say why? Mrs. Fowler's expression grew more sympathetic still. "Lady Cecilia asked if you might join them at tea. She misses you during the day when the guests are about." The Dowager agreed, though I do not think she was pleased. So it was Cecilia's doing. The dear child, trying to include her governess in the family gatherings, not understanding the complexities of social hierarchy that made such inclusion impossible. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Fowler," Lydia said quietly. The next afternoon found Lydia dressed in her best day dress, a simple but well-made gown of dove grey that had been new when her father was alive. She had no jewellery save for her mother's pearl earbobs, which she wore as a small act of defiance against her reduced circumstances. The drawing room of Westmore Hall was magnificent, with soaring ceilings, silk-covered walls, and furnishings that spoke of generations of wealth. When Lydia entered, she found the Dowager presiding over the tea service, surrounded by half a dozen ladies, including Lady Vanessa. Cecilia sat on a small chair, her feet barely touching the floor, looking uncomfortable in her best white muslin dress. "Ah, Miss Hartfield," the Dowager said, as Lydia curtsied. "How good of you to join us. Do sit down." There was an empty chair near the door, clearly placed there for her, apart from the circle of ladies. Lydia took it with as much dignity as she could muster. "Miss Lydia," Cecilia said happily, her small face brightening, "I told Grandmama that you must come to tea with us. Is it not lovely?" "Very lovely indeed," Lydia agreed, accepting a cup of tea from a footman. The conversation resumed, the ladies discussing fashion and society gossip. Lydia remained silent, knowing her participation was not expected or desired. She was there as a living ornament, proof of the Dowager's condescension in honouring her granddaughter's request. "I understand His Grace is expected to return from London this evening," Lady Vanessa said, directing her comment to the Dowager. "I confess I am eager to renew our acquaintance. It has been several months since we last met." "Alexander has been much occupied with parliamentary matters," the Dowager replied, "though I have urged him to attend more to his social obligations. A man in his position cannot remain unmarried indefinitely. He has a duty to his title and his family." The message was clear enough. The Duke needed to remarry, and Lady Vanessa was the chosen candidate. Lydia found herself wondering what the Duke thought of his mother's schemes. But then, she had never heard him express an opinion on anything beyond estate management and politics. "Perhaps Miss Hartfield has views on the subject," Lady Vanessa said suddenly, turning to look at Lydia with that same cold smile. "You have been in this household for some time, have you not? Surely you have observed His Grace's temperament." It was a trap, though Lydia could not immediately see the snare. To comment on the Duke would be impertinent. To refuse would be rude. "I have little interaction with His Grace," Lydia said carefully. "My duties keep me primarily in the nursery wing." "How discreet," Lady Vanessa said, with a little laugh. "The mark of an excellent governess, I am sure." The Dowager's eyes had narrowed slightly, and Lydia realised her mistake. By claiming little interaction with the Duke, she had implied something improper about the question itself. Before anyone could speak further, Cecilia's small voice cut through the tension. "May Miss Lydia come to dinner tonight when Uncle Alexander returns? I should like her to meet him properly." The silence that followed was profound. The ladies stared at the child with various expressions of shock and amusement. The Dowager's face had gone rigid. "My dear child," the Dowager said with forced gentleness, "Miss Hartfield is your governess. She does not dine with the family. That would be most irregular." "But why?" Cecilia asked with a child's innocent persistence. "Miss Lydia is my friend. She takes all her meals with me. Why can she not take dinner with Uncle Alexander?" "Because it is not done," the Dowager said, her voice hardening. "Miss Hartfield has her proper place, and that place is not at the family table. You must learn these distinctions, Cecilia. They are important." Lydia felt her face burning. She wanted nothing more than to flee the room, but she could not move without making the situation worse. "I do not understand," Cecilia said, her lower lip trembling. "Miss Lydia is a lady. Papa told me her father was a viscount." "That will be quite enough, Cecilia," the Dowager snapped. Then, turning to Lydia with ice in her eyes, "Miss Hartfield, I believe Lady Cecilia has had sufficient excitement for one afternoon. Please return her to the nursery." Lydia rose immediately, grateful for the dismissal. She held out her hand to Cecilia, who took it reluctantly, tears beginning to well in her blue eyes. As they left the drawing room, Lydia could hear Lady Vanessa's voice, dripping with false sympathy. Poor child. She does not understand that some falls in fortune cannot be remedied. One might be born a lady, but circumstances can reduce one to something altogether different. The door closed behind them, but not before Lydia heard the Dowager's reply. "Indeed, it is a lesson Miss Hartfield learned, and one I fear Cecilia must learn as well. We are each of us confined to our proper sphere. Lydia's vision blurred as she led Cecilia back up the grand staircase. The child was crying now, confused and upset, but Lydia could find no words of comfort. How could she explain to a 7-year-old girl what she herself had learned so painfully over the past 6 years? That once you fell from your proper sphere, there was no climbing back. You existed in the shadows, useful but unseen, necessary but never valued. That night, after Cecilia had finally cried herself to sleep, Lydia stood once more at her window. Below, in the drawing room, light blazed from every window. She could see figures moving within, ladies in evening gowns, gentlemen in black tailcoats. The Duke had returned from London then. She wondered if Lady Vanessa was down there even now, charming him with her beauty and breeding. Lydia turned away from the window and caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. Dark hair, green eyes, a face that was pleasant enough but unremarkable. She was 8 and 20 years old. She had no fortune, no family, no prospects. She was a governess, a woman who existed between worlds, belonging to neither. She was nobody. In that instant, standing alone in her small chamber, Lydia Hartfield had never felt more invisible in her life. October arrived at Westmore Hall with its customary chill and grey skies. The house party had concluded, Lady Vanessa and the other guests departing with promises to meet again during the London season. Life had returned to its usual rhythm, and Lydia was grateful for the return to routine and invisibility. It was a Tuesday morning when Cecilia complained of feeling unwell. Lydia placed a hand on the child's forehead and felt the unmistakable heat of fever. "Back to bed with you," Lydia said gently, helping Cecilia out of her day dress and into her nightgown. "I shall send for Dr. Thornbury." By afternoon, the doctor had arrived and examined his small patient with grave concern. Lydia waited outside the bedchamber while he spoke with the Dowager Duchess in low tones. "It is scarlet fever, Your Grace," Dr. Thornbury said, his weathered face creased with worry. "The rash is unmistakable, and the fever is high. These cases can be unpredictable. Some children recover fully, others—" He trailed off, but the implication was clear. The Dowager, for all her coldness, had gone pale. What must be done? Keep her cool, force liquids as much as possible, watch for complications. I shall return tomorrow to check on her progress. He turned to Lydia. "Miss Hartfield, you have nursed sick children before?" "Yes, doctor," Lydia said, though her heart was pounding. She had helped nurse her younger cousins through various childhood illnesses before her family's ruin, but scarlet fever was dangerous. "Good. You will need to be vigilant. Do not leave her alone." After the doctor departed, the Dowager stood in the corridor, one hand pressed to her temple. For the first time since Lydia had known her, the formidable woman looked uncertain. "I lost my youngest daughter to fever when she was but 9 years old," the Dowager said quietly, almost to herself. "I cannot lose Cecilia." "We shall do everything possible, Your Grace," Lydia said. The Dowager's eyes focused on her with sudden intensity. "See that you do, Miss Hartfield. That child is all that remains of my second son." Word spread quickly through the household. The Duke, who had returned to London the day after the house party ended, was sent an urgent message. Lydia barely registered these developments. Her entire focus narrowed to the small figure in the bed, burning with fever. The first night was difficult. Cecilia tossed and turned, crying out in her sleep, her skin hot and dry to the touch. Lydia bathed her with cool water, changed her nightgown when it became soaked with sweat, and held a cup to her lips, coaxing her to drink even when the child whimpered that her throat hurt too much. "Please, dearest, just a few sips," Lydia murmured, supporting Cecilia's head. "You must drink to get better." Mrs. Fowler brought tea and bread at midnight, but Lydia left both untouched. She could not eat while Cecilia suffered. Instead, she pulled the rocking chair close to the bed and kept watch, one hand resting on the child's forehead, monitoring the fever. The Duke arrived the next morning. Lydia heard his voice in the corridor, speaking with his mother in urgent tones. She did not see him, but she heard his footsteps pause outside the door to the sick room before moving away. He did not enter. Dr. Thornbury returned as promised and shook his head gravely. "The fever has not broken. Continue as you are doing. Keep her comfortable. That is all we can do." The second day passed in a blur of cool compresses and whispered prayers. Cecilia was sometimes conscious, sometimes delirious. During her lucid moments, she clung to Lydia's hand with surprising strength. "Do not leave me, Miss Lydia," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Never," Lydia promised. "I am right here, darling. I shall not leave you." That night, Lydia sang the lullabies her own mother had sung to her as a child. Her voice was soft and cracking with exhaustion, but she sang nonetheless, stroking Cecilia's damp curls back from her forehead. She did not know that in the corridor outside, the Duke of Westmore stood with his back against the wall, listening to those gentle songs drifting through the door. Alexander Cavendish had not entered the sick room because he could not bear to see his niece suffering as his wife and infant son had suffered. He had watched them die, helpless, and he had vowed never to feel that powerlessness again. So he kept his distance, but he found himself drawn to this corridor, listening to the voice of the woman he had barely noticed for 2 years. The voice was not elegant or trained, but it was filled with such tenderness, such desperate hope, that it pierced something in his chest he had thought frozen beyond reach. The third day, Cecilia took a turn for the worse. The fever spiked dangerously high, and the child barely responded when Lydia spoke to her. Dr. Thornbury was summoned again and left with instructions to prepare for the possibility of the worst. The Dowager came to the doorway but did not enter. "Is there truly nothing more to be done?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I am doing everything I know," Lydia said, and for the first time, the Dowager looked at her not with contempt, but with something approaching respect. Lydia no longer left the room at all. Mrs. Fowler brought meals that went uneaten. Lydia's grey dress was wrinkled and stained with water from the compresses. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung in dark waves around her shoulders. She had not slept in 3 days, catching only brief moments of rest in the rocking chair when exhaustion overcame her. On the 4th night, she ran out of words. She had sung every lullaby she knew, told every story she could remember, recited poetry and passages from books. Now she simply knelt beside the bed, holding Cecilia's small hand in both of hers, and prayed. "Please," she whispered into the darkness, "please do not take her. She is so young. She has so much life ahead of her. Take me instead if you must have someone. But please, please let her live." In the corridor, Alexander stood frozen. He had heard grief before. He had heard fear. But this raw desperation, this willingness to trade one life for another, struck him with the force of a physical blow. Who was this woman who would offer her own life for his niece? Not the distant, colourless figure he had passed in hallways. This was someone entirely different. The 5th day dawned grey and cold. Lydia's hands trembled as she wrung out another cloth in the basin of cool water. Her vision swam with exhaustion. She had not eaten in 2 days, had not properly slept in 5. Her body was beginning to fail her, but she could not stop, would not stop. "Miss Lydia!" The voice was so faint she almost missed it. Lydia's head snapped up. Cecilia's eyes were open, truly open and focused for the first time in days. "Water," the child whispered. "Please." With shaking hands, Lydia held the cup to Cecilia's lips. The child drank, swallowed, drank again. Lydia touched her forehead and felt tears spring to her eyes. The fever had broken. The skin was still warm, but no longer burning. "Oh, thank God," Lydia breathed. "Thank God." She wanted to shout for the household, to ring for Mrs. Fowler, to fetch the doctor, but she found she could not move. Her legs would not support her. The room tilted dangerously, and she gripped the edge of the bed to steady herself. The door opened. Through her blurred vision, Lydia saw a tall figure enter. The Duke. He crossed to the bed in 3 long strides and looked down at his niece. "Uncle Alexander," Cecilia said weakly, but with a small smile. "I have been very ill." "So I understand," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion Lydia had never heard from him. "But you are better now." "Miss Lydia made me better," Cecilia said. "She stayed with me the whole time. She sang to me and told me stories and never left me alone." The Duke turned to look at Lydia for the first time. Really look at her. She was aware of how she must appear, dishevelled and exhausted, her dress stained and her hair loose. But his blue eyes held no judgment. Instead, there was something else in them. Something that might have been wonder. "Miss Hartfield," he said quietly, "you should rest. I will send for my mother and the doctor." "No, I must stay with her," Lydia protested. But even as she spoke, the room spun violently. She felt herself falling, felt her knees give way, and then strong arms caught her before she hit the floor. The Duke had moved with startling speed, and now he held her steady, one arm around her waist, his other hand gripping her shoulder. For a moment, they stood frozen in that position, Lydia pressed against his chest, his face close to hers. She could feel the warmth of his body through the thin fabric of her dress, could smell the scent of soap and something else, something masculine and clean. His blue eyes were wide with concern, searching her face. "When did you last eat?" he asked. I do not remember," Lydia admitted. Her head was spinning, and she could not seem to form coherent thoughts with him so close, touching her. "Or sleep. It does not matter. Cecilia needed me." Something shifted in his expression. His grip on her tightened fractionally, and for a heartbeat, Lydia thought he might say something more. But then he seemed to recall himself and stepped back, though he kept one hand under her elbow to steady her. "You have saved her life," he said simply. "At great cost to yourself." "She is worth any cost," Lydia replied, and meant it with every fibre of her being. The Duke looked at her for a long moment, and Lydia had the strange sensation that he was seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her, not as the governess, not as the impoverished daughter of a ruined viscount, but as a person, as someone who mattered. "Sit," he commanded gently, guiding her to the rocking chair. "I will fetch my mother and Mrs. Fowler. You are not to move from that chair until you have eaten something." Lydia sank into the chair gratefully, her body finally acknowledging its exhaustion now that the immediate crisis had passed. She watched as the Duke went to the doorway and spoke to someone in the corridor. Then he returned to the bedside and placed his hand on Cecilia's forehead, checking for himself that the fever had indeed broken. "You are a very lucky little girl," he said to his niece. "Miss Hartfield is quite remarkable." "I know," Cecilia said, her eyes already drifting closed again, the exhaustion of illness pulling her back towards sleep. "I told Grandmama she was my friend. I love her." Over the child's head, the Duke's eyes met Lydia's again. There was something in that gaze that made Lydia's breath catch, something warm and searching and entirely unexpected. The Dowager Duchess arrived with Dr. Thornbury close behind. There was a flurry of activity as the doctor examined Cecilia and pronounced her past the crisis. Mrs. Fowler appeared with a tray of food, which she pressed into Lydia's hands with tears of relief in her eyes. Through it all, Lydia was aware of the Duke standing near the window, watching her. When the others had left and Cecilia had fallen into a natural, healing sleep, he approached the rocking chair where Lydia sat picking at bread and cheese. "Miss Hartfield," he said quietly, "I owe you a debt I can never repay. You have given me back the last remaining piece of my brother." "I only did what anyone would have done, Your Grace," Lydia said. "No," he said firmly, "not anyone. My mother stood at that doorway for 5 days but could not bring herself to enter the room. He paused, his jaw tightening. "I could not bear to watch another person I cared for slip away. But you never hesitated. You never left her side. You were willing to sacrifice everything for her." Lydia looked down at her hands. "She is easy to love. And you," he said so softly she almost missed it, "are remarkable." Before Lydia could respond, he turned and left the room, leaving her staring after him in confusion and something that felt dangerously like hope. As the evening deepened into night and Cecilia slept peacefully at last, Lydia finally allowed herself to close her eyes in the rocking chair. She was asleep within moments, her head tilted awkwardly against the chair's high back. She did not hear the door open again an hour later. She did not see the Duke enter quietly, carrying his own evening coat over his arm. He stood for a moment, looking at the two figures in the room, the sleeping child and the exhausted woman who had saved her. Then, with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who knew him, he draped his coat over Lydia's shoulders. It was warm from his body and smelled of him. Lydia stirred slightly, but did not wake. Alexander stood there for a long moment, looking down at her face, peaceful in sleep, her dark hair falling across her cheeks. Something had shifted in the 5 days of crisis. Something fundamental had changed. For 2 years, he had walked past this woman dozens of times and never truly seen her. Now, watching her sleep in the chair where she had kept vigil, he realized with startling clarity that he had been blind. She was not invisible. She had never been invisible. He simply had not been paying attention. Alexander left the room as quietly as he had entered, but he did not go far. He settled into a chair in the corridor, maintaining his own vigil through the night. If either of them woke and needed something, he would be there. For the first time in 2 years, the Duke of Westmore felt something stir in the frozen wasteland of his heart. It was small and fragile, this feeling, barely more than an ember, but it was there, warming him from within, and it terrified him. The weeks following Cecilia's recovery passed with a quality that Lydia could only describe as strange. The household routine had resumed, yet something fundamental had shifted, like a painting slightly tilted on a wall, noticeable only to those paying close attention. Cecilia regained her strength gradually, though Dr. Thornbury insisted on continued rest and limited exertion. Lydia returned to their usual schedule of lessons, but now they took place in the sunny sitting room adjacent to the nursery rather than the schoolroom, with Cecilia propped against cushions on the sofa while Lydia sat nearby with books and slates. What had changed, unexpectedly and profoundly, was the Duke's presence. On the first morning back to lessons, Lydia was helping Cecilia practice her French vocabulary when a knock sounded at the door. Before she could respond, the Duke entered, still dressed in his riding clothes, his dark hair slightly windswept. "Uncle Alexander!" Cecilia exclaimed with delight. "Have you come to hear my French?" "I have indeed," he said, crossing to the sofa and dropping a kiss on his niece's forehead. Then, to Lydia's surprise, he turned to her with a small bow. "Miss Hartfield, I hope I am not intruding on the lesson." "Not at all, Your Grace," Lydia said, rising from her chair and curtsying, though her heart had begun to beat rather faster than usual. In 2 years, the Duke had never once attended one of Cecilia's lessons. He settled into the chair opposite hers, and Lydia found herself acutely aware of his presence as she continued the lesson. Cecilia, thrilled to have an audience, performed admirably, reciting French phrases about the weather and the seasons with only minor prompting. "Excellent work," the Duke said when they had finished. "Your pronunciation has improved considerably, Cecilia." "Miss Lydia is a wonderful teacher," Cecilia said proudly. "She speaks French as well as anyone, Papa used to say." The Duke's blue eyes turned to Lydia with interest. "You are fluent in French, Miss Hartfield." "I was fortunate to have an excellent governess myself, Your Grace," Lydia replied carefully. "My father believed in thorough education for his daughters." "How many languages do you speak?" The question was direct, genuinely curious, and entirely unlike their previous brief exchanges about weather and household matters. Lydia hesitated, uncertain how to answer without seeming to boast. "French and Italian with reasonable fluency, Your Grace. Some Latin, though I confess my facility with it has diminished from lack of use." Something flickered in his expression, though she could not identify what. "Impressive. And your other accomplishments? Music, I presume." "I play the pianoforte adequately, though I have had little opportunity to practice in recent years." "There is a pianoforte in the music room that sits largely unused," he said. "You would be welcome to play it whenever you wish, Miss Hartfield. It seems a waste for such an instrument to remain silent." Lydia looked at him in surprise. The music room was in the family wing of the house, not the servants' quarters or the nursery wing. For her to use it would be to cross one of those invisible lines that divided the household so strictly. "That is very generous, Your Grace, but I would not wish to disturb the household." "You would disturb no one," he said firmly. "In fact, I insist upon it. An unused instrument is a tragedy." He rose then, bowed again to both of them, and departed, leaving Lydia staring after him in confusion. Over the following days, the Duke's visits to the nursery sitting room became routine. He would appear each morning after his ride, ostensibly to check on Cecilia's recovery and progress, but he would inevitably remain for the duration of the morning lessons. He asked questions about their curriculum, offered suggestions for books Cecilia might enjoy, and occasionally interjected with his own knowledge when they discussed history or geography. Lydia found herself looking forward to these visits, with an anticipation that both confused and alarmed her. The Duke was not at all what she had imagined during the 2 years of their distant acquaintance. He was intelligent and well-read, with a dry wit that emerged when he was at ease. He listened attentively when she spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and treated her observations with respect rather than condescension. It was dangerous, this growing comfort. Lydia reminded herself constantly of her position, of the impassable gulf between a duke and an impoverished governess. But these reminders grew harder to maintain when he looked at her with those intense blue eyes, as though her opinions actually mattered. One afternoon, when Cecilia had fallen asleep during her rest period, Lydia found herself drawn to the music room. She had not intended to take the Duke up on his offer, but her fingers ached to touch piano keys after years of abstinence. She told herself she would play just one piece, very quietly, where no one would hear. The music room was beautiful, with tall windows overlooking the gardens and walls painted a soft blue-green. The pianoforte was magnificent, a Broadwood grand with a tone that brought tears to her eyes when she played the first notes. She chose a Mozart sonata, one her mother had loved, and lost herself in the music. Her fingers remembered what her mind had tried to forget, the joy of creating something beautiful, of expressing emotions too deep for words through melody and harmony. She did not hear the door open, did not realize she had an audience, until the final notes faded and a voice spoke from behind her. That was extraordinary. Lydia spun on the bench, her heart leaping into her throat. The Duke stood just inside the doorway, his expression unguarded in a way she had never seen before. "Your Grace," she gasped, rising quickly and curtsying. "I apologize. I did not mean to presume. I should not have—" "Please do not apologize for creating something so beautiful," he said, crossing the room toward her. "I heard the music from the corridor and was drawn to it like a moth to flame. That piece, I believe it is Mozart's sonata in a minor." "Yes, Your Grace. It was a favorite of my mother's. She had excellent taste." He gestured to the bench. "Will you play something else?" "Please. I find I am quite starved for good music." Lydia hesitated, but something in his eyes, a genuine hunger for beauty, for connection, made her sit back down. She chose a different piece this time, a melancholy nocturne that seemed to match the grey autumn day outside the windows. When she finished, the Duke had taken a seat in one of the chairs near the pianoforte. His expression was thoughtful, distant. "You said it was your mother's favourite," he said quietly. "She has passed?" "6 years ago, Your Grace. Shortly after my father's death. You lost them both at once then." "I am sorry. That must have been unutterably difficult." There was something in his voice, a shared understanding of loss, that made Lydia brave enough to say, "You understand something of loss yourself, I believe, Your Grace." His jaw tightened, but he did not look away. "My wife died 2 years ago. Childbirth. The baby, my son, died with her. It was, as you say, unutterably difficult." "I am sorry," Lydia said softly. "Cecilia has mentioned how much she misses her aunt. Catherine was kind to her," the Duke said. "Though in truth, my marriage was not, that is to say, we were not—" He stopped, seeming surprised at his own candor. "Forgive me, I do not know why I am speaking of such things." "Sometimes," Lydia said carefully, "it is easier to speak of difficult things with someone who stands outside one's usual circle. There is a freedom in it." "What?" He looked at her then, with such intensity that she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You are wise as well as talented, Miss Hartfield. I begin to wonder what other qualities I have failed to notice in 2 years of passing you in corridors." Before Lydia could formulate a response to this extraordinary statement, the door opened and Cecilia appeared, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Uncle Alexander," she said happily. And Miss Lydia, are you having a visit without me? The Duke's expression softened as he looked at his niece. We were simply discussing music, little one. Miss Hartfield has been entertaining me with her considerable skill at the pianoforte. Oh, I love when Miss Lydia plays, Cecilia said, climbing onto the bench beside Lydia. Will you play something cheerful? Something we can sing to? And so Lydia found herself playing nursery songs, while Cecilia sang in her high, clear voice, and the Duke of Westmore sat listening with something very close to contentment on his usually stern face. It became a pattern. Each afternoon, when Cecilia woke from her rest, the three of them would gather in the music room or take walks in the gardens, wrapped in warm cloaks against the autumn chill. Cecilia, with a child's intuitive understanding, began to engineer these encounters with increasing frequency. Uncle Alexander, will you not join us for our nature walk? She would ask innocently. Miss Lydia says we are to collect leaves for pressing, and I am sure you know the best trees. Or, Uncle Alexander, Miss Lydia is reading us The Odyssey. Would you like to hear about Odysseus? You could help explain the difficult parts. The Duke, to Lydia's surprise, accepted these invitations with what seemed like genuine pleasure. During their walks, he would point out features of the estate, share stories of his childhood explorations with his late brother, ask Lydia's opinions on matters ranging from crop rotation to the education of women. They existed, during these hours, in a strange bubble separate from the rest of the world. There was no Duke and governess, no unbridgeable social divide, only three people who had found unexpected comfort in one another's company. The Dowager Duchess, of course, observed these developments. Lydia would catch her watching from windows or doorways, her expression unreadable. But the older woman made no comment, and Lydia told herself that Margaret likely viewed the Duke's attention to his niece's education as a passing phase, something that would fade once Cecilia was fully recovered. Surely the Dowager still believed her son would eventually do his duty and marry someone suitable, someone like Lady Vanessa Blackwell. Lydia was merely a temporary distraction, too insignificant to warrant concern. Yet there were moments when Lydia caught the Duke looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch. Moments when their hands would accidentally brush as they walked, and neither would immediately pull away. Moments when a shared glance across Cecilia's head would convey more than words ever could. It was dangerous and foolish and entirely improper, but Lydia could not seem to stop her heart from hoping for something she knew to be impossible. November arrived, with frost on the windows and fires lit early in the grates. One evening, the Duke invited Lydia to dine with him and Cecilia in the small family dining room, a much more intimate space than the grand formal dining hall. It is Cecilia's birthday tomorrow, he explained. She wished to celebrate tonight, just the three of us, before the larger party my mother has planned for tomorrow afternoon. It was the first time Lydia had ever sat at table with the Duke as anything approaching an equal. She wore her best dress, the dove grey silk, and had taken extra care with her hair. Across the candlelit table, Alexander, she could not help but think of him by his Christian name now, even though she would never speak it aloud, watched her with an attention that made her acutely conscious of every movement, every word. Cecilia was in high spirits, chattering about her upcoming party and the gifts she hoped to receive. But eventually, her excitement exhausted her, and Mrs. Fowler came to take her up to bed, despite her protests that she was not at all tired. You may stay a moment longer, Miss Hartfield, the Duke said as Lydia made to rise, if you are willing. I find I have a question I wish to ask you. Lydia settled back into her chair, her heart beating faster. They were alone in the dining room, the footman having withdrawn. It was highly improper, but she found she did not care. What question, Your Grace? He leaned forward, his blue eyes intent upon her face. These past weeks, getting to know you properly, have been. That is to say, I find myself wondering why I never took the time before to discover what an extraordinary woman you are. Lydia felt heat flood her face. Your Grace, I am simply a governess. There is nothing extraordinary about me. You are wrong, he said quietly. So very wrong. You saved Cecilia's life. You have educated her not just in facts, but in compassion. You speak 3 languages, play the pianoforte beautifully, and possess an intellect I have rarely encountered even among the most educated men of my acquaintance. And yet you claim to be simply a governess, as though that were something lesser. It is something lesser, Lydia said, struggling to maintain her composure. By the standards of society, Your Grace, I am very much reduced from what I once was. Then society is blind, he said with sudden fierceness. And I have been equally blind. He reached across the table, and before Lydia could react, he had taken her hand in his. His grip was warm and strong, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm that sent shivers through her entire body. Miss Hartfield, Lydia, he said, and hearing her Christian name on his lips made her breath stop entirely. I find myself in a position I did not anticipate. I find myself caring what you think, valuing your company, looking forward to each day because I know I will see you. This is not something I expected. It is not something I was looking for, but it is nonetheless real. Lydia stared at him, unable to form words. This could not be happening. A duke did not speak such words to his niece's governess. It was impossible, improper, dangerous to them both. Your Grace, please, she managed finally, though she did not pull her hand away. You must not say such things. Your position, your duty to your family, my duty, he said bitterly, has occupied my every thought for 32 years. Perhaps it is time I considered what I wish, rather than what is expected. Before either of them could say more, the dining room door opened, and the Dowager Duchess entered. Her eyes immediately took in the scene, her son holding the governess's hand across the table in the candlelight, their heads bent close together. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the Duke released Lydia's hand and stood, his expression closing like a door slamming shut. Mother, he said coolly, did you require something? The Dowager's face was a mask of controlled fury. I came to discuss tomorrow's arrangements, but I see you are otherwise occupied. Lydia rose quickly, curtsying. Your Grace, forgive me. I should return to my rooms. She fled before either of them could stop her, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Behind her, she could hear the Dowager's voice, low and angry, though she could not make out the words. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Lydia pressed her hands to her burning cheeks and tried to calm her racing thoughts. Nothing could come of this. Whatever the Duke felt or thought he felt, it was impossible. He would marry someone suitable, someone like Lady Vanessa, and Lydia would remain what she had always been, invisible and alone. But her traitorous heart whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, something had changed. That perhaps she was not quite so invisible anymore. And that hope, fragile as spider silk, was the most dangerous thing of all. November arrived at Westmore Hall with bitter winds and early darkness. The tension between what was and what could never be hung over the household like smoke from the drawing-room fires, visible to some, ignored by others. Lydia had tried to maintain distance after the evening. The Dowager had discovered her son holding the governess's hand across the dinner table. She took her meals in her rooms, kept Cecilia's lessons confined to the nursery wing, and avoided the family areas of the house entirely. But Alexander, as she now could not help but think of him, seemed determined to make such avoidance impossible. He appeared at the nursery each morning without fail. He suggested walks that became routine. He asked questions about Cecilia's progress that inevitably led to longer conversations about education, philosophy, and the wider world. And Lydia, despite every rational instinct screaming caution, found herself unable to refuse him. She learned things about him during those November days. He had not loved his late wife, though he had respected her and mourned the tragedy of her death. His own father had been cold and demanding, more concerned with the ducal title than with his sons as individuals. His brother, Cecilia's father, had been his closest friend, and that loss still carved a hollow space in his chest. In turn, Alexander drew stories from Lydia she had not told another soul. The shame of her father's death, discovered slumped over his desk with an empty laudanum bottle beside him after the final creditor's letter arrived. The way her mother had simply faded after that, as though grief had extinguished her will to live. The awful months of watching their belongings sold, their home claimed, their friends evaporating like morning mist. "You were alone," Alexander said one grey afternoon as they walked the gardens while Cecilia collected the last of the season's leaves. "Completely alone." "I had distant cousins who offered me a home," Lydia replied, pulling her cloak tighter against the wind. "But it would have been as a dependent, a poor relation to be tolerated out of duty. I chose employment instead. At least as a governess, I could maintain some dignity." "Dignity," he repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I begin to understand why that matters so much to you." But it was not just these conversations that drew them together. Lydia watched how Alexander interacted with the household staff, treating them with respect that seemed unusual among his class. She noticed his attention to details of estate management that benefited the tenant farmers. She saw his patience with Cecilia, the way he listened to her childish observations as though they held genuine worth. One afternoon, Lydia discovered something that shifted her understanding of him entirely. She had gone to the kitchens to request a special tea for Cecilia, who was feeling slightly unwell, when she overheard Cook speaking to Mrs. Fowler. "His Grace saved her position," Cook was saying in low tones. "The Dowager wanted Mary dismissed after that business with the broken vase, but His Grace intervened. Said it was an accident, and the girl had been in service here since she was 12. He would not hear of turning her out without a character." Mrs. Fowler's response was warm with approval. "He's a good man, for all his stern ways. Remember when the Jennings family had that trouble with the roof? His Grace had it repaired at his own expense, told them not to worry about the rent that quarter. And young Tom, the stable boy, whose father took ill, His Grace paid for the physician and sent round food every week until the man recovered." Lydia withdrew quietly, her heart full of a dangerous warmth. This was not the cold, distant Duke she had imagined for 2 years. This was a man of genuine compassion who hid his kindness behind aristocratic reserve. That evening, unable to contain her curiosity, she mentioned the incident with Mary to Alexander during one of their now regular conversations after Cecilia had gone to bed. "How did you know about that?" he asked, surprise evident in his voice. "I have ears, Your Grace, and servants talk." He looked uncomfortable, as though caught in an act of which he was almost ashamed. "Mary has been with this household since childhood. One broken vase does not undo years of loyal service. My mother has rather strict views on such matters. But the decision was ultimately mine to make. There was also a family called Jennings," Lydia said softly, "and a stable boy named Tom." Alexander's jaw tightened. "You have been listening to a great deal of servants' gossip, Miss Hartfield. I have been learning that the Duke of Westmore is not at all what I believed him to be." Their eyes met across the small parlour where they sat, Cecilia sleeping in the adjoining chamber. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with an energy Lydia did not fully understand, but felt in every nerve of her body. "And what did you believe me to be?" Alexander asked quietly. "Cold," Lydia admitted. "Remote, concerned only with duty and position. And now? Now I think perhaps you hide behind duty, because you have been taught that compassion is weakness, that caring too much leaves one vulnerable." He stared at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. "You see too clearly, Lydia." The use of her Christian name, without her title, sent heat rushing through her. She should object, should insist on proper formality, but the words sounded like a caress on his lips, and she could not bring herself to stop him from saying it again. What Lydia did not know was that Alexander had been conducting his own investigation. 2 weeks earlier, he had summoned his secretary, Mr. Davies, a discreet man of middle years who had served the family for decades. "I need you to look into something for me," Alexander had said. "Miss Hartfield, the governess. I wish to know everything about her circumstances, her family's ruin, what became of her after her parents' deaths. But be discreet. I do not wish her to know of this inquiry." Mr. Davies had returned 3 days later with a folder of papers and a story that had made Alexander's chest tighten with a mixture of admiration and fury at the injustices of the world. Viscount Hartfield had been a good man, perhaps too good. When his younger brother had accumulated ruinous gambling debts and faced debtor's prison, or worse, the Viscount had used his own money and mortgaged his estate to pay them. The brother had promised reform, then promptly gambled away more money before dying of a sudden apoplexy, leaving the Viscount responsible for even more debt. Unable to bear the shame and knowing his family faced ruin, the Viscount had taken his own life. His widow had survived him by only 4 months, dying of what the physician had called a failure of the heart, though everyone knew it was grief and despair that had killed her. Lydia, at 22, had been left with nothing. No fortune, no family willing to take her in without making her feel the weight of her dependence. And 3 offers of marriage, all from men twice her age who made clear they wanted a young, biddable wife who would be grateful for any security offered. She had refused them all and taken the first position as a governess she could find. She could have married, Mr. Davies had said, his voice holding uncommon emotion for the usually reserved man. She could have had security, a home of her own. But she chose honest employment over a mercenary marriage. One must admire such principle, Your Grace. Yes, Alexander had agreed quietly. One must. Now, nearly 2 weeks later, watching Lydia across the parlour as firelight played across her features, Alexander found himself imagining what his life might have been if he had met her 6 years ago, before his own dutiful marriage, before the walls around his heart had been built so high. I have a proposition for you, he said suddenly. Tomorrow evening I wish to discuss Cecilia's education with you properly. Not here, not in snatched moments between other obligations, but properly. Will you dine with me in my private study? We can speak freely there, without interruption. Lydia hesitated, knowing such a meeting crossed every line of propriety. A governess alone with her employer in his private chambers, behind closed doors. If anyone discovered it, her reputation would be destroyed. But looking at Alexander's face, seeing the need there that matched something in her own heart, she found herself nodding. Yes, she said quietly. I will come. The following evening, Lydia dressed with more care than usual, selecting her best gown, the dove-grey silk that brought out the green in her eyes. She told herself this was merely a professional meeting, a discussion about Cecilia's curriculum, but her hands trembled as she pinned up her hair. Alexander's study was a revelation. Unlike the formal rooms of Westmore Hall with their gilt and grandeur, this space was comfortable and lived in. Books lined every wall, papers covered the large desk, and a fire burned cheerfully in the grate. A small table had been set near the fire with 2 chairs and place settings for dinner. Thank you for coming, Alexander said, rising from his desk as she entered. He wore no coat, only his shirt and waistcoat, more informal than she had ever seen him. The intimacy of it made her breath catch. You said you wished to discuss Cecilia's education, Lydia reminded him, though her voice sounded uncertain even to her own ears. Yes, he agreed, guiding her to one of the chairs. Among other things, dinner was served by a footman who withdrew immediately, leaving them alone. They began with safe topics, Cecilia's progress in languages, her interest in natural history, whether she should begin more formal music instruction. But gradually, inevitably, the conversation deepened. They discussed philosophy, arguing good-naturedly about Locke versus Rousseau on the nature of education. They debated literature, discovering a shared love of Shakespeare's tragedies and disagreement about the merits of contemporary poetry. They talked about the responsibilities of privilege, the obligations of those born to power toward those with none. You believe the aristocracy has a duty beyond maintaining their own position, Lydia observed, watching him across the small table. That is unusual among men of your class. I was taught that rank is a responsibility, not merely a privilege, Alexander replied, though I confess I have not always lived up to that ideal. I have been, as you so accurately observed, too focused on duty and too frightened of vulnerability. And now? Lydia asked softly. He reached across the table and took her hand, just as he had done weeks before when his mother had interrupted them. But this time, there was no one to interrupt, no one to judge, only the 2 of them in the firelight. Now I find myself questioning everything I thought I knew, he said, about duty, about propriety, about what I want from the years I have remaining. I am 33 years old, Lydia. I have done everything expected of me, followed every rule, fulfilled every obligation, and I have been miserable. Your Grace. Alexander, he corrected. Please, when we are alone like this, I would have you use my name. Alexander, she said, and the word felt like a gift on her tongue. What are you saying? I'm saying that these past weeks, getting to know you, talking with you, seeing the world through your eyes, have been the happiest I have been in years, perhaps ever. And I find I do not wish to return to the way things were before. Lydia's heart was racing so fast she felt dizzy. But what can change? You are a duke. I am a governess. The distance between us cannot be bridged by conversation and goodwill alone. Can it not? He challenged. Who decides these rules, Lydia? Who determines that because I was born to a title and you were born to less fortune, we must remain in our separate spheres regardless of what we might feel? Society decides, Lydia said, though her resolve was weakening. Your family decides. The Dowager would never accept. My mother does not rule my life, Alexander said firmly. I have allowed her too much influence for too long, but in this, the decision is mine alone. He rose and came around the table, drawing her to her feet. They stood close together, his hands holding hers, his blue eyes searching her face. Tell me you feel nothing, he said. Tell me these weeks have meant no more to you than they would with any employer, and I will never speak of this again. We will return to our proper roles, and I will trouble you no further. Lydia tried to speak, tried to form the lie that would save them both from this impossible situation, but the words would not come. Because it would be a lie. Everything in her responded to him. Everything sang when he was near and ached when he was away. I cannot tell you that, she whispered, because it would not be true. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Alexander raised one hand to her cheek, his touch gentle, questioning. Lydia leaned into it without thinking, closing her eyes against the sweetness of the gesture. We are crossing a line, she said. A line that cannot be uncrossed. I know, he replied, but I find I no longer care. He did not kiss her, though Lydia sensed he wanted to. Instead, he simply held her face between his hands and looked at her as though memorizing every feature, every line, as though she were something precious and rare. I do not know how to make this right, he admitted. I do not know how to bridge the distance between what is and what could be. But I know I must try, Lydia. Because the alternative, returning to the way things were, pretending you are merely the governess and I am merely the duke, would be a form of death. Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. Your mother will never accept this. Society will never accept this. Then society can be damned, he said with sudden fierce intensity. I have lived my entire life for others' expectations. Perhaps it is time I lived for my own. Later, when he walked her back to her chambers, they paused outside her door. The corridor was dark and silent, the household long since retired. Alexander still held her hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm that made her shiver. Thank you for tonight, he said softly, for your honesty, for your trust. What happens now? Lydia asked, frightened and hopeful in equal measure. Now we face whatever comes, he replied. Together. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the gesture both chaste and utterly intimate. Then he released her and stepped back. Good night, Lydia. Good night, Alexander. She slipped into her room and closed the door, leaning against it with her heart hammering. Through the wood, she heard his footsteps pause, then slowly walk away. Lydia crossed to her window and looked out at the dark gardens. Something fundamental had shifted tonight. Lines had been crossed. Words had been spoken that could not be unspoken. They both knew it, both felt it. And somewhere in the house, in her own chambers, the Dowager Duchess stood at her window as well, watching the lights go out one by one, calculating, planning, preparing to protect her son from what she saw as a disastrous mistake. The battle lines had been drawn, though neither Alexander nor Lydia fully understood yet what they would be facing, but they would face it together. That promise, whispered in the darkness of a private study, would be tested far sooner than either of them imagined. The morning after their dinner in his study, Alexander awoke with something he had not felt in years: hope. It was fragile and terrifying, but it glowed warm in his chest as he dressed and prepared to join Lydia and Cecilia for their morning lessons. But when he arrived at the nursery sitting room, he found only Cecilia, working dutifully on her slate, while Mrs. Fowler sat nearby with mending. "Where is Miss Hartfield?" Alexander asked, trying to keep the concern from his voice. "Her Grace the Dowager summoned Miss Hartfield to her private sitting room an hour ago, Your Grace," Mrs. Fowler said, her expression troubled. "She has not yet returned." A cold weight settled in Alexander's stomach. He knew his mother well enough to recognize a strategic strike when he saw one. In the Dowager's sitting room, Lydia stood with her hands clasped before her, fighting to maintain her composure as Margaret Cavendish circled her like a hawk, examining wounded prey. "You understand, of course, why I have asked you here," the Dowager said, her voice cold and precise. "No, Your Grace. I confess, I do not," Lydia replied, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Do not insult my intelligence with false ignorance, Miss Hartfield. I have eyes. I have ears. The entire household has observed my son's growing attachment to you. What I wish to know is what you have done to encourage it." "I have done nothing, Your Grace. I have simply performed my duties." "Your duties," Margaret interrupted sharply, "are to educate my granddaughter, not to bewitch my son with whatever arts you have employed. Do you take me for a fool? I know how women like you operate." Heat flooded Lydia's face. Women like me. Women who have fallen from their station and see in a wealthy, titled man an opportunity to reclaim what they have lost. "You are not the first governess to set her cap at her employer, Miss Hartfield, though I confess you have been more subtle than most. Your Grace, I assure you, you have been using my granddaughter," Margaret continued, her voice rising, "manipulating my son through his affection for the child. It is despicable, calculated, and I will not tolerate it under my roof." Lydia's composure finally broke. "How dare you suggest I would use Cecilia in such a manner? That child is dear to me. I would never exploit her for personal gain." "Would you not? Then explain to me why my son, who has barely noticed your existence for 2 years, is suddenly taking all his meals in the nursery wing, spending hours in conversation with you, looking at you as though you were something precious rather than something employed." "I cannot explain your son's actions, Your Grace." "You would have to ask him." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "I see. You claim complete innocence in this affair. Very well. Let me be direct, Miss Hartfield. I am prepared to offer you a substantial sum of money, enough to live comfortably for several years, if you will quietly resign your position and leave Westmore Hall immediately." Lydia stared at her, shocked into momentary silence. "You are trying to pay me to leave? I am offering you a generous settlement in exchange for removing yourself from a situation that has become untenable. Surely you must see that nothing can come of my son's infatuation. He is a duke. You are an impoverished governess. The match is impossible, and every moment you remain here you damage your own reputation and his standing. I am offering you a way to leave with your dignity intact and your future secured." For a long moment, Lydia was tempted. The money would mean freedom, independence, an end to the constant uncertainty of her position. But then she thought of Cecilia, who had already lost so much, who clung to Lydia with a desperate need that spoke of depths of loneliness no 7-year-old should feel. "I cannot accept your offer, Your Grace." Margaret's expression hardened. "Cannot or will not? Both. I will not abandon Cecilia when she needs me, and I will not allow you to dictate my future based on suspicions and assumptions about my character." "So you refuse to leave?" Margaret said slowly. "Even knowing that your presence here damages my son, even knowing that you can never be anything more to him than a servant. I refuse to be bullied into abandoning a child I have grown to love," Lydia corrected, her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. "If His Grace wishes me to leave, he need only say so, and I will go immediately. But I will not be driven away by insinuations and bribes." Margaret's face flushed with fury. "You insolent girl, you forget yourself." "No, Your Grace, I know precisely what I am. I am a woman who has lost everything and rebuilt her life through honest work. I am a governess who loves the child in her care, and I am someone who will not be bought or intimidated, no matter how much power you wield." The dowager's hands were shaking with rage. "Get out of my sight. But understand this, Miss Hartfield. You have made an enemy today. I will not forget this insolence, and I will ensure that you regret refusing my generous offer." Lydia curtsied and left, her legs barely supporting her weight. Outside in the corridor, she leaned against the wall and pressed her hands to her burning cheeks. She had just made a powerful enemy, and she had no illusions about what Margaret Cavendish could do to someone in her position. But she had meant every word. She would not abandon Cecilia, and she would not let the dowager's prejudices dictate her actions. What Lydia did not know was that Margaret had already set her next strategy in motion. That very afternoon, letters were dispatched to various aristocratic families, inviting them to a house party at Westmore Hall to celebrate the Christmas season. Among those invited was Lady Vanessa Blackwell. The dowager's plan was simple: surround Alexander with suitable young women of his own class, remind him of his duty and position, and make the distance between a duke and a governess so glaringly obvious that he would come to his senses. 3 days later, the first guests began arriving. Westmore Hall came alive with activity: footmen carrying luggage, maids preparing chambers, cook in a fury of preparation in the kitchens. Lydia received her orders from the dowager through Mrs. Fowler. She was to keep Cecilia in the nursery wing for the duration of the house party. She was not to supervise any of the arrangements, not to appear at meals, not to intrude upon the guests in any way. "Her Grace was very clear, Miss Hartfield," Mrs. Fowler said apologetically. "You and Lady Cecilia are to remain in your quarters." "I understand," Lydia said quietly, though the message was unmistakable. She was being deliberately isolated, hidden away like something shameful. Cecilia was confused and hurt by the sudden change. "Why can I not see Uncle Alexander?" she asked plaintively. "Why must we stay up here all the time? Your grandmother has guests, dearest," Lydia explained as gently as she could. "Important people who require your uncle's attention. We must not disturb them." But explaining it to Cecilia was easier than accepting it herself. Through the floors, Lydia could hear music and laughter. She could imagine Alexander down there, forced to dance with Lady Vanessa, to make conversation with young ladies chosen specifically for their suitability as duchesses. And she could do nothing but wait. On the 4th day of the house party, Alexander finally broke free of his social obligations long enough to climb to the nursery wing. He found Lydia reading to Cecilia, both of them curled on the sofa near the fire, and the domestic peace of the scene made his chest ache. "Uncle Alexander," Cecilia cried, launching herself at him. "I have missed you terribly. Why do you not visit us any more?" "I have been occupied with guests, little one," he said, holding her close. Over her head, his eyes met Lydia's, and she saw frustration and anger there. "But I am here now." After Cecilia was settled back with her book, Alexander drew Lydia aside, speaking in low tones. "My mother has told me of your conversation. The offer she made." "Yes," Lydia said carefully. "I declined." "Why?" The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "You could have had independence, freedom. Why would you refuse?" "Because I will not abandon Cecilia, and because I will not let your mother dictate my future through threats and bribes." Something fierce and admiring blazed in his expression. "You are remarkable." "I am stubborn," Lydia corrected. "And possibly foolish." "Lydia." But before he could continue, the door opened and the dowager swept in, her face thunderous. "Alexander, you are needed downstairs. Lady Vanessa has been asking for you." "Lady Vanessa can wait," Alexander said coldly. "I am visiting with my niece." "Now, Alexander." The command in her voice made even Lydia flinch, but Alexander simply crossed his arms and stared at his mother with an expression Lydia had never seen on his face before. Open defiance. "We need to speak, mother, in private." The confrontation that followed took place in the dowager's sitting room, and the entire household heard the raised voices, though not the specific words. It was the first time anyone could remember the Duke raising his voice to his mother. Inside, Alexander faced Margaret with barely controlled fury. "You offered Lydia money to leave. You have isolated her and Cecilia from the household. You have invited Lady Vanessa here specifically to parade her before me. Do you think I am blind to your manipulations? I am protecting you, Margaret shot back, from a disastrous mistake that would ruin your standing and damage this family's reputation, by driving away a woman I care for, by treating her like some scheming adventuress when she is nothing of the sort. You care for her? Margaret's voice dripped with disdain. Alexander, she is a governess, an impoverished governess at that. Your father would be ashamed. Wow. My father was a cold, controlling man who cared more for the title than for the people who bore it. I will not live my life according to his dictates or yours. You have a duty to this family, to your title, to produce an heir with a woman of suitable birth. Your marriage to Catherine was appropriate, even if not happy. This obsession with Miss Hartfield is beneath you. The mention of his late wife made Alexander's jaw tighten. You dare invoke Catherine's memory to manipulate me. She would have been appalled by your treatment of Lydia. Catherine knew her place, Margaret said coldly. She understood duty. She did not fill your head with romantic nonsense that could never lead anywhere proper. Romantic nonsense? Alexander laughed bitterly. Is that what you call genuine affection? Respect? The first real connection I have felt with another person in years. Margaret's expression softened slightly, attempting a different tack. My son, please. Think of Cecilia. If you form an attachment to her governess that society finds scandalous, it will reflect on her. She will bear the burden of your impropriety. This arrow hit its mark. Alexander's face went pale. What do you mean? I mean that if the Duke of Westmore marries beneath him, makes a spectacle of himself over a governess, society will remember. And when Cecilia is grown and ready for her own season, they will whisper about her uncle's unsuitable marriage. Her prospects will be damaged by your selfishness. Alexander stood silent, clearly torn. Everything he had ever been taught told him his mother was right. Duty came before personal desires. The needs of the family superseded individual happiness. And Cecilia, innocent Cecilia, should not suffer for his choices. I need time to think, he said finally, his voice hollow. Think all you wish, Margaret replied, sensing victory. But I trust you will reach the only sensible conclusion. Sometimes love, if that is what you believe this to be, means letting someone go. Alexander left without another word. He did not return to the nursery wing that day or the next. Instead, he threw himself into the role of host, dancing with Lady Vanessa and the other guests, making conversation, playing the part expected of him. From her window, Lydia watched carriages come and go, saw elegantly dressed ladies strolling the gardens even in the cold. She saw Alexander among them, a tall figure always surrounded by admirers, always at the centre of attention. And she understood what the Dowager had accomplished. That night, alone in her chamber, Lydia sat at her small writing desk and drew out paper and pen. Her hand trembled as she wrote, but the words came clearly. Your Grace, it is with great regret that I tender my resignation as governess to Lady Cecilia Cavendish, effective the 1st of the new year. I have valued my time in service to your family, but I believe it is now time for me to seek a new position. I will of course remain until a suitable replacement can be found. Your obedient servant, Lydia Hartfield. She sealed the letter and placed it in her desk drawer. She would give it to Alexander after the house party concluded, after the guests had departed. She would not make a scene, would not give the Dowager the satisfaction of seeing her driven away in disgrace. She would leave quietly, with dignity, taking nothing but the memories of a brief time when she had been seen, truly seen, by someone who mattered. And if her heart broke in the process, well, that was the price of having dared to hope for something impossible. Lydia pressed her hands to her face and allowed herself to cry, silently, in the darkness. Tomorrow, she would be strong again. Tomorrow she would smile for Cecilia and maintain her composure. But tonight, she could grieve for what might have been and never would be. December arrived at Westmore Hall with frost thick on the windows and a house full of glittering guests. The ancient estate had been transformed into a showcase of aristocratic splendour, every room blazing with candlelight, every surface decorated with greenery and ribbons in preparation for the Christmas season. Music drifted from the drawing rooms at all hours, accompanied by laughter and the rustle of expensive silks. In the nursery wing, far removed from the festivities, Lydia sat with Cecilia at the small table, attempting to maintain their usual routine while the world beyond their door celebrated without them. "Why can we not go down to see the decorations?" Cecilia asked for perhaps the 10th time that week, her small face pressed against the window overlooking the front drive. "I can see the carriages arriving. The ladies wear such beautiful gowns. Why must we stay up here?" Lydia set down the book she had been reading aloud and crossed to stand beside the child. Below, another carriage was indeed arriving, disgorging passengers in elegant winter attire. She recognized Lady Vanessa's distinctive dark hair as the woman swept into the house on a wave of expensive perfume and confidence. "Your grandmother has many important guests, dearest," Lydia explained gently, though her heart ached at the disappointment in Cecilia's eyes. "They require your uncle's attention for business matters. We would only be in the way." "But Uncle Alexander used to visit us every day," Cecilia said, her lower lip trembling. "Does he not love me any more?" The question pierced Lydia's composure. "Of course he loves you. He is simply very busy with his duties as host." It was a lie, or at least a partial one. Alexander had not visited the nursery wing in over a week, not since his confrontation with his mother. Lydia had glimpsed him occasionally from the windows, always surrounded by guests, always with Lady Vanessa at his side. The Dowager's strategy was clearly working. The days passed in painful isolation. Lydia distracted Cecilia with stories, games, and lessons, but the child's confusion and hurt were evident, and Lydia's own emotional state was deteriorating. At night, alone in her chamber, she would stand at her window and watch the lights blazing below, imagining Alexander dancing with Lady Vanessa, laughing at some witty comment, slowly forgetting the governess hidden away above stairs. The resignation letter remained in her desk drawer, waiting. She had not yet found the courage to deliver it, knowing that once she did, everything would become irrevocably real. For Alexander, the week had been a special form of torture. He moved through the social obligations his mother had orchestrated, dancing with Lady Vanessa and the other eligible young ladies, making appropriate conversation, playing the role of the eligible duke seeking a bride. But every moment felt hollow, and his gaze constantly drifted toward the ceiling, toward the nursery wing where Lydia was confined. He was trapped between duty and desire, between what he had been taught was right and what his heart insisted was true. His mother's words about Cecilia's future haunted him. What right did he have to damage his niece's prospects for his own happiness? Was that not the height of selfishness? Yet every time he looked at Lady Vanessa's beautiful, empty smile, he thought of Lydia's intelligent green eyes and genuine warmth, and something in him rebelled against the future his mother had planned. The guests were beginning to comment. Lord Pembroke, an old friend of Alexander's late father, had remarked on his distraction. "You seem elsewhere, Westmore. The lovely Lady Vanessa is clearly smitten, yet you treat her with mere courtesy. Are you unwell?" "Merely fatigued, my lord," Alexander had replied, but the lie sat bitter on his tongue. On the 10th day of the house party, Dr. Thornbury arrived for a dinner engagement. The Dowager had organised it as a gesture of gratitude. She proclaimed loudly to all who would listen for the doctor's care of Lady Cecilia during her illness. It was to be a grand affair, a formal dinner with all the house guests in attendance. Mrs. Fowler brought the news to Lydia late that afternoon, her expression troubled. "Her Grace has requested your presence at dinner this evening, Miss Hartfield." Lydia looked up from the primer she was reviewing with Cecilia, startled. "I beg your pardon?" "You are to attend the dinner as a gesture of thanks for your care of Lady Cecilia during her illness. Her Grace was most insistent that you be present when Dr. Thornbury is honoured." Every instinct Lydia possessed screamed warning. The Dowager's sudden generosity was no such thing. This was a trap, though she could not yet see its precise nature. "I see. What time am I expected?" 7 o'clock in the grand dining room, Miss Hartfield. Her Grace suggested you wear your best gown." After Mrs. Fowler departed, Lydia stood at her wardrobe, staring at the few dresses hanging there. Her best gown was the dove grey silk, simple but well made, appropriate for a governess, but woefully inadequate for a formal dinner party. Exactly the point, she realized. She would be put on display, a shabby figure among the peacocks, her inadequacy made glaringly obvious to everyone present, most especially to Alexander. "You look worried, Miss Lydia," Cecilia observed. "Do you not wish to go to the dinner?" Lydia forced a smile. "I am simply nervous, dearest. I am not accustomed to such grand occasions anymore." That evening, dressed in her grey silk with her mother's pearl earbobs as her only jewellery, Lydia descended the grand staircase with her heart pounding. The sounds of conversation and laughter grew louder as she approached the dining room, and she paused outside the double doors, gathering her courage. The footman opened the doors, and conversation faltered as heads turned to see who had arrived. Lydia stepped into the room, acutely conscious of every eye upon her. The grand dining room of Westmore Hall was magnificent, with a table that could seat 40 guests, crystal chandeliers blazing overhead, and walls hung with portraits of Cavendish ancestors. Tonight, perhaps 30 people were gathered, all dressed in evening finery that made Lydia's simple gown look like servant's dress by comparison. At the head of the table sat the Dowager, resplendent in deep purple silk and diamonds. To her right was Alexander, devastatingly handsome in his evening clothes, his face carefully neutral. Beside him sat Lady Vanessa in crimson silk that clung to her figure, sapphires glittering at her throat and ears. "Ah, Miss Hartfield," the Dowager said, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent room. "How good of you to join us. You may sit there, at the far end." She indicated a chair at the very bottom of the table, as far from the places of honour as it was possible to be while still technically present. The placement was a deliberate insult, and everyone in the room understood it. Lydia made her way to the indicated seat, aware of the whispers and curious stares that followed her progress. She took her place with as much dignity as she could muster, keeping her eyes downcast. Dr. Thornbury, seated in a position of honour near the Dowager, caught her eye and offered a small, sympathetic nod. At least one person in this room did not view her as something contemptible. Dinner was served, course after elaborate course, while conversation flowed around Lydia without including her. The guests near her end of the table were minor gentry, and they spoke among themselves with studied politeness, carefully excluding the governess from their discussions. From his position near the head of the table, Alexander's jaw was so tight it ached. He could see Lydia, isolated and diminished, deliberately placed where her inadequacy would be most apparent. His mother had orchestrated this beautifully, he thought bitterly. A public humiliation disguised as an honour. He met Lydia's eyes once across the length of the table, and the pain he saw there nearly undid his composure. But Lady Vanessa chose that moment to place her hand on his arm, drawing his attention back with some comment about the excellent wine, and the moment was lost. Midway through the meal, the Dowager rose slightly, tapping her glass for attention. "My friends, we are gathered tonight not only to celebrate the season, but to honour two individuals whose dedication saved my granddaughter's life. Dr. Thornbury, your skill and care were invaluable." Dr. Thornbury inclined his head graciously. "And Miss Hartfield," the Dowager continued, her voice taking on a different quality. "Our governess, who nursed Lady Cecilia through 5 days and nights of crisis with admirable determination." Lydia felt her cheeks burn as all eyes turned to her once more. The Dowager's tone suggested she was praising a faithful dog rather than a person. "Indeed," Dr. Thornbury interjected, his voice firm. "Miss Hartfield's devotion was extraordinary. I have rarely seen such selfless dedication. She did not leave the child's side for 5 days, forsaking food and sleep to provide constant care. Lady Cecilia would not have survived without her." "How admirable," Lady Vanessa said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Such dedication to one's employment is so rare these days. You must be very proud of your servant, Your Grace." The deliberate use of the word servant made several guests shift uncomfortably. "Miss Hartfield is a governess, not a servant," Alexander said, his voice cold. "There is a distinction." "Of course, Your Grace," Lady Vanessa replied with a smile that did not reach her eyes, though one wonders if such distinctions matter much in practice. After all, she is paid to perform a service, is she not? The Dowager smiled thinly. Lady Vanessa makes a fair point. We must all remember our proper place in the household hierarchy. It is what maintains order and propriety. She turned her gaze directly on Lydia, and there was malice in those cold brown eyes. Some people, I have noticed, tend to forget their station. They begin to imagine themselves equal to those they serve, developing ambitions quite inappropriate to their circumstances. The insult was barely veiled, and the guests exchanged glances, sensing drama unfolding. Lydia kept her eyes on her plate, willing herself not to react, not to give the dowager the satisfaction of seeing her hurt. But Lady Vanessa was not finished. "I have heard stories," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed room, "of governesses who use the children in their care to advance their own position, who manipulate the natural affections of a household to gain influence beyond their rightful place. Such women are, in my opinion, the worst sort of opportunists." The implication was unmistakable. Every person at that table understood that Lady Vanessa was accusing Lydia of using Cecilia to ingratiate herself with Alexander. Lydia's hands trembled in her lap, but she forced herself to remain still, to maintain the mask of composure even as something inside her crumbled. Alexander's face had gone white with fury. He opened his mouth to speak, but his mother forestalled him. "Lady Vanessa is quite right," the dowager said, her voice ringing with authority. "Ambitious women who forget their place can cause tremendous damage to a household. One must be vigilant against such inappropriate presumption." She looked directly at Lydia, and when she spoke again, her voice was loud enough for every person in that room to hear clearly. "After all, we cannot have people pretending to be something they are not. Miss Hartfield may have been born to better circumstances, but those circumstances no longer exist. She is a nobody now, a woman with no family, no fortune, no position in society. She's a nobody pretending to be someone she's not, and such pretense does a disservice to everyone." The words fell into absolute silence. Even the footman serving the meal seemed frozen in place. Lydia felt the world tilt around her. The humiliation was complete, total, executed with surgical precision before an audience of the most powerful people in the county. The dowager had not merely insulted her, she had destroyed any remaining shred of dignity Lydia possessed. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Lydia rose from her chair with trembling legs, her napkin falling unheeded to the floor. "If you will excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I find I am unwell." She turned toward the door, every step requiring immense effort, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She would not cry here, would not give them that final humiliation. Behind her, she heard the scrape of another chair, heard Alexander's voice beginning to speak, but she did not stop. She could not stop. If she stopped, if she looked back, she would shatter completely. She had almost reached the door when she heard it. Alexander's voice, clear and firm, cutting through the shocked silence like a blade. "Miss Hartfield, wait!" But Lydia kept walking, her hand reaching for the door handle. She had endured enough. She could not bear to hear whatever platitude or apology he might offer, could not stand to see pity in his eyes. The footman opened the door, and Lydia stepped through into the corridor beyond, leaving behind the glittering company and the ruins of whatever fragile hope she had dared to harbour. In the dining room, Alexander stood frozen, watching her go, his mother's words still echoing in his ears. "She's a nobody." The cruelty of it, the calculated viciousness, finally shattered the last chains of duty and expectation that had bound him. He started to follow her, then stopped. If he turned this into a scene in the corridor, his mother would only sharpen her cruelty, and Lydia would be the one who bled for it. He needed privacy and leverage, not another spectacle. And in that moment, watching Lydia's proud, broken figure disappear through the doorway, Alexander Cavendish, Duke of Westmore, made a decision that would change everything.